Hey middle schoolers, so good to see you guys. This video is for March 29th youth group. Last week was technically spring break for you guys, even though you guys are now on, I think, week 2 of your quarantine. So I hope you guys are doing well. Feel free to give me a text or give me a call or give me an email, keep in touch with me, and I'm trying to keep in touch with your parents, and just hope that you guys are doing really, really well. You're going to have to deal with the sound of my chickens making noises here in the background. So what I want to do with you guys here today is just talk through a couple different Bible passages that I've been thinking about here this week, and we've got some things to think about, and then I want you guys to have a conversation with your parents about some of these questions and about some of these things that I'm going to bring up here today. So if you've got a Bible, go ahead and grab it. And I'm going to start in Genesis, actually. So really, really easy. Genesis chapter 1, right at the end of chapter 1. We're going to talk about this idea of Sabbath here today. Sabbath is a thing that we don't think about very often. Or usually when we think about a Sabbath, we just think about a day off, maybe. So you might hear the term like, that's my Sabbath day, or I take a Sabbath. And a lot of people in our culture today think of Sunday as a Sabbath day. What that means for us today is very different even from what it meant for me back in the 1990s as a kid growing up. And then it was very, very different from that in the 1950s or 1960s. It started to change even more. And then if you go back even farther than that, maybe to the 1800s in America, it was very, very different. But when my parents were growing up, so in the 1950s, my parents were growing up, like Sunday, everything would be closed. So no stores would be open. So it's actually a little bit of like what's going on here now every single day for us in the quarantine. That's kind of how it was every single Sunday for my parents in the 1950s. When I was growing up, it was much more, there was much more a culture of people who went to church, and it was a lot more widespread. Of course, there were a lot of people who didn't, but certainly were a lot of people who did. And now today, things have changed to the point where there's probably a majority of people who do not go to church on a Sunday, and a lot of people who do sports and all kinds of other stuff on a Sunday. And so it's just this idea of what we think of as a Sabbath day, we don't really have a very good idea of what it means. So let's read from Genesis chapter 1. This is starting with verse 31. Then I'm going to go through chapter 2, verse 3. It says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now this word that you guys will see here, I'm reading from the New International Version, and in verse 2 it says, rested, and then in my Bible it has a little small letter next to it, the letter C, and if you go and look at what that Hebrew word actually means, it literally means to cease. So cease, like stopping. So you could read it this way in verse 2, that on the seventh day God ceased. So he ceased from doing things, and he blessed the seventh day. So have you ever had something in your life that was supposed to be fun, but it turned into something that was really life-draining? So I'll give you a couple examples from my life, stuff that you guys probably know about from my life. One is soccer. So when I was younger, I was a pretty good soccer player, but I wasn't like the best soccer player, so I was always on a B team, select team. And I remember a few coaches when I was younger saying that sometimes what happened with the kids who were on the really advanced soccer teams that would travel around a lot is that by the time they got to high school, they would actually burn out on soccer, meaning they wouldn't want to do soccer anymore, and by the time they got to be juniors in high school, they might not even be playing soccer at all anymore. And I went through, and I became a pretty good player, but I went through high school soccer, and I ended up playing on the varsity team junior and senior year. But almost all, and I want to say probably 75% of the kids that were on the A team in front of me. I ended up beating out for the team, or a lot of them just dropped out along the way. They never developed. A lot of them just straight up burned out on soccer because it had become such a thing that was so central to their life. It was so all consuming of their life. So it started out as being something really fun when they were a little kid. It turned into something that was life draining. Another thing, this actually happened for me, was the saxophone. When I was playing saxophone, I was a good saxophonist. I was a good musician, and I loved creating music and creating art. And by the time I got into high school, I was quite a good saxophone player. I was in like Jazz One and in the top bands and all that stuff. And I remembered the more I would get into these, we'd have to do different competitions like solo ensemble. Some of you guys are doing solo ensemble. I know that was supposed to be around this time of year. But what would happen is I started losing my love for the saxophone because it became so serious. It became so all-encompassing. It became such a competition that I just didn't want to do it anymore. So have you ever had something like that? Where it started out as something fun, but then it turned into something that just took up too much of your time. It took up too much. So what's happening in your life right now? Think about what's going on right now in your life with the quarantine. You are at home. You are being forced to cease. So this word, where we get the word Sabbath from in the Bible, ceasing, you are ceasing from doing a whole lot of things right now. And what might be happening in your life is you might actually realize that there is something that is in your life that was fun, or it was life-giving, and now that it's being taken away from you, you're actually realizing that it was taking life away from you. Was there something that you were doing that you had to do all the time? Like, was it basketball practice and games, and you just always constantly did it all the time, and now that you're not doing it, you're realizing, wow, that was really taking up a ton of time. Look at all this time that I had. On the other hand, some of us haven't stopped or ceased at all during this time. Some of us, we've had this time in quarantine, and yet we're just filling it up with hours of technology, or hours of social media, or hours of other things, video games or movies. Have you been resisting the ceasing? Have you been continuing to do stuff even though this is an opportunity for you to take a break from some things? Has it just caused you to do some of these things even more? So a question that I have you been able to hear God's voice in the midst of your time off? Right? Or do you now have all this time and you just fill it up with all kinds of different things? I'm going to read this other passage. This is from the book of 1 Samuel. If you guys don't know where that is, it's probably about, 8 or 9 books into the Bible. You can also look it up. But it's 1 Samuel, and it's chapter 21. So you can go ahead and flip there. And it's a story about David. And this is before King David became the king. And he was being pursued by King Saul. They oftentimes did not get along very well. And what's happening here is David is fleeing from Saul, and he's going to meet up with some of his men. And he goes to the priest in the temple, and he's fleeing. And here's where this story picks up right here. So this is verse 2, starting halfway through verse 2. David says, "As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread, provided the men have kept themselves from women." David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So what's happening here is they're in the temple, and there's all this bread. In fact, every single week, the high priest would bake these 12 loaves of bread, and they'd put this bread in the Holy of Holies, which is the place where God's presence actually was. Now, the only person that was allowed to go in the Holy of Holies was the high priest, and that's because they were the only one that were ceremonially clean. they were set apart for that purpose. And the bread that was there, the 12 loaves of bread, was to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And what it was representing was that God was going to provide for all of the needs of the 12 tribes of Israel. So here comes David coming into the temple, and what does he do? He asks the high priest for something to eat for his men, and the priest says, I don't have any ordinary bread, however I have this consecrated bread. Now the only person that was supposed to eat that was the high priest at the end of the week. And but in this case, David ate the bread. All right, now that's a story. All right, let's open up to Luke chapter 6. It's going to make sense here once we read this, okay? So here's Luke chapter 6. This is Jesus now. This is the New Testament. It says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Jesus answered them, have you never read what David and his companions did when they were hungry? Hey, we just read that. He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. We just read that. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So, there's a lot of things going on here, but I'm going to connect it to a few things in my life and in your life, okay? Back in February, I got tired of sports. I am the type of guy who likes to keep up on sports, so I'll keep up on all the Wisconsin sports teams, and I'll go on ESPN a couple times a day just to keep up on standings and stats. I'm that kind of a person, and so some of you know exactly what I mean, and some of you think that that's really kind of lame. But I started asking this question just a few months ago, really. It was just a few months ago. I said, what would happen if I didn't watch sports this year? So what would happen if I just stopped rooting for the Packers this year? What would happen if I didn't follow the Brewers or follow the Bucks? And I started thinking about it. I was like, man, the Bucks might win the NBA championship this year. That would be really hard not to follow that. I was thinking, man, the Packers should have a good team. The Brewers should have a good team. I want to watch March Madness. There's all this stuff. So I started thinking about all of these things in my life. And I started thinking about how much time I spend watching sports. I was like, wow, this is a massive amount of time that I watch sports, or I follow sports, or I keep up with sports online. And in our culture, it might be sports, it might be Instagram, it might be keeping up with pop music or celebrities. Fill in the blank for whatever it is for you. What do you fill your time doing? Do you just fill your time scrolling through Instagram? For me, it was sports. I would feel, if I was bored, I would go to ESPN.com and just read some articles to do that. In Jesus' day, it was the Sabbath. So life revolved around the Sabbath. So I want you guys to realize this. What you guys are going through right now with the quarantine, that's essentially how it was for the Jewish people in Jesus' day, 24 hours every single week. So from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, it was Sabbath, and you could not work. So there were all these rules about what you could and couldn't do. So when we read the story in Luke chapter 6, and Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field and picking heads of grain off of the grain and eating it, there's people that got mad at him because that was technically considered working on the Sabbath. So that's how rigorous and strict they were. And so they had this culture where it was extremely serious. The way that we kind of are, or that I am about like sports, which is like, I got to keep up with them. I'm always going to keep up with them. I'm always going to watch the Packers. I'm always going to keep up with the Bucks. I'm always going to do that. That's how they were about the Sabbath. We're always going to do this. Every single week we're going to do this. We're going to cease. And who would have thought that in our culture that sports would be ceased from? Think about that. The thing that I was thinking about 2 months ago has actually happened now. It's happened. We don't have any more sports. A lot of the things that we enjoy, the things that we're into, the things that we love to do, even going out to eat, we can't do it anymore. Who would have thought that would have happened? And think about what Jesus was doing in his culture with the Sabbath. He was ceasing from the Sabbath. which is to say he was ceasing from ceasing. It's kind of a crazy thing. And why did he do that? He did it because even the Sabbath became something that people idolized. It was more important than God. It was more important than people. It came in the way of their relationship with God. Even though they thought they were doing a good thing by following the Sabbath, it was actually getting in the way of the way that they would treat people. And so I want you to think about that as well. You know, what is it in your life that gets in the way of how you treat people, of how you love people? What gets in the way of how you pay attention to people? What gets in the way of how you serve people in your family, in your neighborhood? Are you filling your time with so many things that you don't have time for people and for God? I want you to think about that. Even something really good and holy and religious like the Sabbath can become a thing that gets in the way of loving God and loving people. And when Jesus saw that, he confronted it. And he said, listen, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Which is like saying, I am the Lord of ceasing. I know how to cease. You don't need to teach me how to cease. I know how to do it. And so this is an opportunity. This is right now for you. What is it that you feel like God is calling you to cease from doing? What have you been doing? You are stuck at home. You have a different pattern of life now. What is it that you do that you feel like God is asking you to cease from? Is there something? Maybe you're like me. Maybe it's sports. This has been a really refreshing time. Ever since we haven't had sports, guess what I've been doing? I've been working on my music. I've been editing my music. I've been recording music. I've been working on this thing that God has put in me to do. Or how about this? Maybe for you it's the opposite. What is it that you have been ceasing from that you need to cease from? So that I use like a double negative there. What is it that you're not doing that you should be doing? That's another way of saying it. What's something that you need to start up? Maybe with this time, God is asking you to start something up. And so, like I said, for me, I used to make music so much, and the more I do that, the more I feel like a person. And do you have something in your life that makes you feel human, that makes you feel like a person? And is it something that you need to start up again? Is it something that you need to start doing again, that you need to get into again? So we're going to talk about Sabbath over the next couple weeks, because the Bible has a ton. It really revolves around this idea of Sabbath, and we're going to go more deeper into that over the next couple weeks and what that has to do with our lives as middle schoolers. But I hope that this week, what you're challenged to think about and challenged to talk about with your parents too is there something in my life that I feel like God is asking me to cease from? Or is there something that I'm already ceasing from that I need to start up? Is there something that God is asking me to start doing? Now I have time to do it. And so that's my challenge to you guys this week. Love you guys. I hope you're doing well. Like I said, feel free to get in touch with me and contact me if you need anything. And I really hope that you may take advantage of this week. Make the most of the time that you have now. All right. God bless. We'll see you guys.